Welcome to episode 139 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. This time we're going to talk about AC/DC's international debut album from 1976, High Voltage. And what I have here is a European reissue of unknown vintage, probably sometime in the 1980s. So as I said, this is the international debut. This is actually their third release overall, and this is actually a compilation. It's a mashup of their first two releases, which were albums only released in Australia. And those were called High Voltage, not to be confused with this one, and their second Australian album, TNT. If you're going to talk about AC/DC, you kind of have to start with the Young brothers. Malcolm and Angus were the youngest two sons of William and Margaret Young, who were a working class Scottish couple who lived in Glasgow. They had a total of 8 kids, 7 of whom were boys. As a family in Scotland, they were never particularly well off, and they decided in 1963 to take advantage of the Australian government's assisted passage migration scheme. For a £10 fee for each adult and free for kids, you were basically given passage over to Australia. The Australian government did this because they wanted to increase population, they wanted to supply their growing industries, and reading between the lines, of course, they wanted to increase their population with white people. But when people got there, things weren't always as the Australian government had promised. So the Young family arrived in '63. They stayed at the Villawood Migrant Hostel, and the brothers tell the story of their parents basically weeping upon arrival. There was cold running water, there were snakes on the floor, and so on. So it was a pretty sketchy first few months. But slowly life began to take on a more acceptable hue, and in a really fortuitous development, one of the key connections that the family made was a friendship made by George, which was with Harry Vanda, who was another migrant who was also staying at the detention center. Though both in their teens, George and Harry were both accomplished guitarists at this point, and they began a musical partnership which was to pay huge dividends, not just for themselves, but for Malcolm and Angus in the coming decade. George and Harry began to experience success with a band they had formed called the Easy Beats. In 1966, the Easy Beats actually had 2 #1 singles. Angus and Malcolm were still at school in the 1960s and were not really making a priority of their studies, but they too were both focusing on the guitar and were both becoming very proficient. As the 60s gave way to the 70s, they were initially able to ride their brother George's coattails by being involved in a group which George and Harry had created called the Marcus Hook Roll Band. Not a particularly noteworthy band. They released one album, Tales of Old Granddaddy, which didn't do anything. In 1973, however, things began to get serious, and Malcolm and Angus formed the band AC/DC. Originally, it was formed as a glam rock band. It had Malcolm on rhythm guitar, Angus on lead guitar, Colin Burgess on drums, Larry Van Crete on bass, and Dave Evans on vocals. By 1974, they had established a pretty solid reputation as a live act. So solid, in fact, that when Lou Reed came to tour Australia, they actually opened up for him on that tour. Through their connections with George, they managed to get a deal with Albert Records out of Sydney to release a single with Evans singing, and that single was Can I Sit Next to You Girl. In 1974, the band decides to relocate to Melbourne, and they also decide to give up the glam rock thing and to focus much more on heavier blues rock, and this decision basically spells the beginning of the end for Dave Evans as a singer. And then eventually he leaves in the middle of the Lou Reed tour. When the band gets to Adelaide in September 1974, they still don't have a singer, they're just getting up on stage and playing instrumentals. And this is where Bon Scott enters the picture. Bon Scott, of course, had a fair amount in common with the Young brothers. Like them, he was Scottish, and also like them, he was a recent immigrant to Australia. As a young singer and general hanger-arounder, he'd worked odd jobs, he'd been to prison, he'd tried to join the army, but he'd been rejected as being socially maladjusted. He was also in a couple of different bands, the Valentines, who were a bubblegum band, who actually had a fair degree of success, had some TV appearances. Bon, who'd been a singer with the Valentines, then joins a band out of Adelaide called Fraternity as their singer. They were touring the UK, and one of the bands they opened up for in their UK tour was a band called Geordie out of Newcastle. And Geordie, of course, were the band that Brian Johnson was singing for. And so on this tour, Bon actually gets to know the guy who would eventually replace him in AC/DC, thought well of him, thought well of his talents as a singer, and in fact, it was Bon's good opinion of Brian Johnson which led the Young brothers to feel that reaching out to Johnson after Bon's untimely death was a good move for the band. Bon's back in Australia in 1973-74. He's hanging out with kind of musical collective in Adelaide called Mount Lofty Rangers. He's in a bit of a fight with some of the members of the band, storms out, crashes his motorbike, and suffers very serious injuries. He was in a coma for a while, actually. In his recovery, he's looked after by some of the people in that whole musical world. He's doing odd jobs, doing a bit of this and a bit of that, and he gets introduced to George Young, who in turn gets him involved in AC/DC circle, originally as a driver, but it's also known that he's a singer. And that night in September 1974, during the gig, they're up there playing instrumentals. People are saying, go on, Bon, go up and give it a go. Finally, he gets up on stage, jams for them the rest of that night, and the rest is history. They never looked back, and the chemistry was instantaneous. AC/DC had gotten a deal with an Australian label, Albert Records, which had, of course, its own studios, Albert Studios in Sydney. And it's there they produced their first two albums only for Australian release, and both of these are produced by Harry Vanda and George Young. At this stage, in 1974, the lineup of the band was still pretty fluid beyond the Young brothers and Scott. For the first album, a guy called Rob Bailey was the nominal bass player. He played a lot of the tracks, but George Young also sat in. And most of the drumming on the first album is actually done by a session guy, called Tony Carenti. The record's released in February 1975, and it goes to number 14 in Australia, and right away they get back into the studio in March to record their follow-up. In the intervening period, the band's lineup had actually solidified, with Mark Evans joining on bass and Phil Rudd, who would be the band's long-term drummer, joining as well. Of the 9 songs in this new album, called TNT, 8 of them were Young, and Scott originals. The only cover was a song by Chuck Berry, School Days. TNT, when it's released later that year, does really well, and it goes to number 2 in Australia, and on the strength of that, the band secured themselves an international recording deal with Atlantic Records out of New York. The decision was made that their international debut would be a compilation record drawing for their first 2 Australian records. What the High Voltage track list is basically the TNT track list with 2 changes. Removed from the TNT track list are School Days by Chuck Berry and one of the originals, a song called Rocker. Just 2 songs are added from their Australian debut, and those are Little Lover and She's Got Balls. The album starts with 2 classics which are about as close to narrative epics as anything AC/DC ever wrote. The first of these is It's a Long Way to the Top If You Want to Rock and Roll. The more you read about their struggles growing up and their struggles making it in the business, particularly Bon Scott's struggles, you can just smell the veracity here. You can smell the hard work and the sweat and the toil and the fist fights and all the rest of it on the way to the top. It also famously has a bagpipe solo played by Bon Scott, which kind of puts it in rarefied company along with Mull of Kintyre and maybe a handful of other much less memorable songs. But setting aside the bagpipes, the real magic in this song, as so many other places in this album, is the vocal delivery by Bon Scott. It was never a pose for him. These kinds of songs always seem legitimately autobiographical. And much the same can be said of the very next song, Rock and Roll Singer, which is one of my favorite AC/DC songs. The whole band is great here. Angus is playing as fantastic as it was on the opening song. But again, this is largely all about Bon, just that incredible vocal delivery, defiant, funny, the whole 9 yards. For those high points, things get a little more rudimentary with the Jack, which is kind of a basic slow shuffle. It's a song about gonorrhea, which, puts it again in rarefied company. And this song is also one of the earliest examples of that gang vocals style of backup singing. The main letdown, I think, is that it gets pretty repetitive towards the end. This is one of those songs, and there's a few here that could have used a slightly more stringent edit in the control room. The side closes out with Live Wire, which has a nice, slow build to it. The song's pretty good. It's a very raw sound to it, particularly the background vocals. It's kind of a fine line between raw and amateur sounding, and I think this record occasionally strays onto the amateur side of the line. Side 2 starts with TNT, which is a great little piece of heavy pop, I guess. That's followed by Can I Sit Next to You Girl, which of course is the re-recorded version of the song, which was originally released as a single with Dave Evans on vocals. It's another song, I think, where there could have been a little bit of a tighter edit. Then we have Little Lover, which is a tremendously sleazy lyric. It's also got a Coca-Cola reference in the lyrics, which is a little bit ironic because Bon had actually filmed a television ad for Coca-Cola in Australia. Now we arrive at She's Got Balls, which is an odd kind of a tune, just a grungy, sleazy kind of a lyric. And at the same time, a very earnest attempt to praise a woman whom the singer feels is a steadfast, generally solid kind of a person. As a song, I would say this is more funny and earthy than it is good. Never mind though, because the closing track is one of the best things they ever put down on record, which is the title track, High Voltage. Like all good AC/DC songs, it has multiple excellent riffs, and it has a tremendous groove by that stellar rhythm section. So I've heard this album a lot of times, and when I thought about doing this review, in my mind I was thinking I was going to give it a 3.5. Kind of the historical impression in my head was that this was kind of a raw, early piece of their catalog, and they got a lot slicker and a lot better as time went on. But I gave it a really thorough listening prior to doing this review, and all I can say is I don't know what I was thinking. This is an album full of truly excellent hard rock songs, almost all of which are in either E or A, almost all of which use 3 or 4 chords, almost all of which squeeze every last single nugget you can get out of the basic blues scale in E. It's a raw record, it's not perfect, it needs, to my ears, a bit more discipline in production, but there's virtuosity, good songwriting, witty lyrics, amazing rhythm playings, and spontaneity by the truckload. I think this record only improves with the passage of time, and I give it 4.5 out of 5 stars.